Kansas Territory. Spring of 1873. The wind carried dust across the wide, open plains, and the blood on Delia Cartwright's cheek hadn't yet dried when the cowboy stepped between her and the man who struck her. "Touch her again," the cowboy said, voice low and steady, "and I will bury you myself." Delia's knees were shaking, but she stayed on her feet. She held her jaw where it throbbed, her eyes locked on the stranger in the brown duster who now stood between her and Cyrus Boone, the suitor she had refused for the last time. Cyrus, red-faced and breathing heavy, stared at the cowboy. "You got no business here." The cowboy didn't flinch. "I make it mine when a lady gets hurt." Delia had never seen him before. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair wind-blown and sun-lightened. A revolver rested on his hip, but his hands were empty. He did not look like a man who needed a weapon to make a point. Cyrus spat. "She's mine to court. She just needs to learn her place." "I think she already knows it," the cowboy said, his voice tight. "You're the one lost." There was a stillness then, the kind that comes right before thunder. Delia feared Cyrus would lunge again, but instead he turned and stalked off across the dirt road, muttering curses under his breath. The cowboy turned to her. "Are you hurt bad?" Delia shook her head. "No, just—" Her voice cracked. "Thank you," he nodded, eyes narrowing as he studied her bruised face. "Name's Colton Dorsey. Came into town for supplies. Did not expect a fight." "I am Delia Cartwright," she said. "And I did not expect a savior." They stood in silence for a moment outside the trading post, the late sun low behind them. She tasted copper in her mouth but still managed a small smile. "Let me help you inside," Colton said. He offered his arm but did not touch her until she took it. Inside, the storekeeper gave her a cloth with cool water. Colton stood aside, watching her with quiet respect. When she finished wiping the blood from her lips, she looked up at him. "You should not have gotten involved." "I could say the same to you," he said gently. "But some men do not take no kindly." Delia looked away. "I have told Cyrus Boone no more times than I can count, but out here, that does not matter to some folks." Colton leaned against a stack of flour sacks. "It matters to me." The next morning, Delia found Colton waiting by the fence of her family's small horse ranch. Her father had passed 2 winters ago, and she had run it alone since. Cyrus had offered help, then demanded her hand in return. When she refused, he turned cruel. "You came back," she said, brushing hay from her skirt. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," Colton replied, "and I figured you could use a hand. I cannot pay you, not asking you to." She looked at him long. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because I can." It felt strange letting someone in. But she nodded, and he followed her to the barn. By afternoon, the horses were fed, stalls cleaned, and the fence mended. Colton worked without complaint, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Delia caught herself watching the way he moved, calm, steady, like he had seen worse than hard labor. "Over supper," she asked, "where are you headed?" "Nowhere in particular," he said. "My brother died last year, left me his land out in Colorado, but I have not gone back yet, been riding since." Delia hesitated. "Running from something?" He looked at her with quiet eyes. "Trying to feel again," she nodded. "I understand." That night a knock came at the door. She opened it to find Cyrus, drunk and swaying, a pistol in hand. "You think you can shame me?" he slurred. "You brought a man into your house. You think that makes you better than me?" Colton stepped out from the shadows, gun drawn. "Put it down, Cyrus." Cyrus raised his weapon and Delia screamed. One shot cracked through the night. Then silence. Cyrus clutched his shoulder, falling to his knees. "You shot me. You'll live," Colton said coldly, "but you'll never raise a hand to her again." Delia trembled, heart hammering. Colton turned to her slowly. "You all right?" she whispered. "I am now." By morning, the sheriff had taken Cyrus off to jail. No charges were filed against Colton. The town knew Cyrus's reputation. Delia stood beside Colton outside the barn. "I do not know how to thank you," she said. "You do not have to," he replied. "But if you want, I could stay a while, help with the ranch." Delia blinked, warmth rising in her chest. "I would like that," he smiled, genuine this time. "Then I will stay." And just like that, something shifted, not fast, not loud, but sure. Like the first green shoot after winter, by late April, the days stretched longer than the nights and the warmth settled deep into the soil. The land around Delia's ranch, dry but not barren, took the sun like an old friend. Colton began rising before first light, hauling water, splitting wood, seeing to the horses without needing to be asked. She watched him from the porch once, the way he leaned into each motion like the work gave his hands purpose. One morning, she handed him a tin of coffee as he dried the sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. "You ever break a horse?" she asked. He took the tin and sipped before answering. "A few, not always well." "Well enough," she said, nodding toward the young roan gelding she hadn't yet dared try. "He's green and too clever by half. I've been meaning to start him, but I've only got so many bones to spare." Colton looked toward the horse, who stood just past the fence line, tail flicking. "He's got spirit. So do hornets, and I don't ask them to haul fence posts." He gave a soft chuckle, low and brief. "I'll give it a go." It took 3 days. The first, Colton didn't touch the horse at all, just stood near the corral, reading the animal's movements, letting him circle and snort and stare. Delia kept to the tack room but left the door open. On the second day, he stepped into the ring, gentle and slow, speaking in a tone too low for her to catch. By the third, the saddle was on, and by late afternoon, Colton was astride, riding in tight, cautious loops as the gelding tossed his head but didn't buck. When he stepped down, Delia handed him a damp cloth for his neck. "You got a way about you." "He needed someone to listen first," Colton said, rubbing the cloth along his jaw. "Most do." That night, Delia brought out a spool of mending and sat beside the hearth while Colton read from a worn book she hadn't known he carried. The fire snapped softly, and outside, a coyote yipped once before falling quiet. She didn't look up from her stitching. "Why haven't you gone on to Colorado?" Colton turned a page with a careful hand. "The land's there, but nothing waits for me on it. I think I stayed moving so I wouldn't have to admit that." Delia tied off the thread and set the shirt aside. "I reckon a man's allowed to want more than land." He set the book down. "I've been wondering if I might find it here." She looked over then. The lamp on the table cast amber light across his face. "What would you need to stay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "A reason, one that doesn't wear out when the work gets hard." Delia's throat felt tight, but not from sorrow. "I don't plan on making it easy." "I wouldn't ask you to." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "Come morning, I'll show you the North Stream. It's been low, and I want to see if the cattle have wandered." He stood too. "I'll be ready." They didn't touch, but when she closed the door for the night, her fingers lingered on the latch just a moment longer than before. The next day dawned windless and bright. They rode out past the grazing hills where the grass thinned and the soil turned pale with clay. Delia led, reins loose in her hand, eyes scanning the ridgeline. Colton followed without speaking. At the stream bed, the water barely whispered across the rocks. Delia dismounted and crouched near the edge, brushing her fingers along the muddy bank. "They've been through here, hoof prints fresh." Colton knelt beside her, studying the impressions. 3, maybe 4 head. Then they're still nearby. They followed the tracks west, and after a short climb, they found the cattle clustered near a shaded grove. Delia whistled low, and the animals lifted their heads but didn't bolt. "You always know where to look," Colton said as they turned back. Delia pulled her hat lower against the sun. You learn fast, or you lose stock. They rode in companionable silence until the house came into view again. As they approached the barn, Delia slowed her horse. Colton, he looked over, if you're still wanting a reason to stay. She hesitated, then met his eyes. You've been giving me one. He didn't answer. He simply reached over slow and sure and brushed a curl of wind-tossed hair from her temple. His fingers were calloused, warm. I'll stay, he said. She nodded. Good. That night she left her door unlatched, not for fear, for trust. The rains came in May, quiet at first, then steady and sure, soaking the dust roads and softening the pastures into green. Delia stood beneath the lean-to beside the barn, watching the water bead on the wooden railings. Colton was inside, stripping old leather from a harness, his sleeves rolled but his collar still buttoned against the chill. You ever get used to the quiet after a storm? She asked without turning. No, he said from behind her. I think it's the only sound that still surprises me. She stepped back under the roof and met his gaze. You were in the war, his hands paused. Georgia, infantry, she waited. I was 19, he continued. Didn't know a thing about killing. By the time Sherman marched through, I didn't know much else. Delia crossed her arms. My uncle died at Cold Harbor. My mother never forgave the world for it. Colton hung the harness from a rafter and leaned against the wall. I never thought I'd come this far west. Just wanted the noise to stop. It's different out here. It is, he said. But grief doesn't mind the soil. She nodded once. No, it doesn't. Later, by the stove, she handed him a bowl of stew while the wind curled around the eaves. He ate without speaking, pausing only to let the warmth settle. She watched the way he handled the spoon careful, like he didn't take hot food for granted. When my father took sick, she said slowly, folks stopped coming around. Thought I'd sell the place or worse, marry quick just to stay afloat. Colton didn't interrupt. I stayed, she continued. Even when the bank man tried to warn me off, even when Cyrus started circling, Colton set the bowl aside. You held this place together. She met his eyes. I didn't want to need anyone. You don't, he said, but needing and choosing aren't the same. She looked down at her hands, calloused and dry. I don't know how to let someone help without feeling like I've given something up. You haven't, he said, and you won't. Not with me. The next morning they rode north to check the wellhead by the old cottonwoods. The trail was narrow and slick, and Colton rode behind, calling out when her mare slipped on a patch of clay. You want me to take the lead, he called. I'm fine, she said, steadying the reins. She just doesn't like the mud. At the well, they found the bucket rope frayed to threads. Colton crouched to test the pulley. She'll hold a little longer, he said, but not much. I've got spare line in the smokehouse, Delia said. Thicker than this. They worked in rhythm, passing tools and tying knots until the new rope was in place. As Colton turned the crank, drawing a clean bucket from the deep, he looked over at her. You ever think of leaving Kansas? She shook her head. My family's buried here. I couldn't leave them behind, he nodded. I understand. They drank from the dipper, one after the other, and then stood in the hush of branches stirring above. I used to think I was just passing through, Colton said. Now I find myself looking forward to the next day. Delia didn't smile. She only reached for the dipper again and handed it back. Then stay long enough to see summer come. That night they sat outside, watching lightning flicker far off toward the west. The air was still, heavy with the smell of wet sage and wood smoke. Colton leaned back against the porch post, his boots crossed at the ankle. My brother's name was Ali, he said. He was younger by 2 years. He used to make up stories when the shells were close, just to keep me from shaking. Delia looked toward the edge of the trees. I used to sing to the horses when I was scared, not loud, just under my breath. made me feel like someone else was listening. Colton turned his head. You still sing, she hesitated. Only when I'm alone, he didn't press her. I'd like to hear it sometime, when you're ready. She gave a small nod. Maybe. Fireflies drifted through the tall grass, blinking like scattered stars. Colton rubbed his thumb along the worn brim of his hat. You were right, he said. It is different out here. Delia didn't look at him, but her voice was soft. So are you. He reached over, slow and careful, and let his fingers brush hers where they rested on her knee. She didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted her hand so their palms touched, warm and solid. Neither of them spoke after that. They didn't need to. The wheatgrass had reached knee-height by early June, and the scent of wild rose clung to the fields along the southern edge of the property. Delia rode the boundary fence alone that morning, reins looped in one hand, the other resting on her thigh. The sky stretched pale and clear above her, cloudless for the second day running. When she returned, Colton was already at the forge near the barn, sweat darkening his collar as he hammered a rusted hinge back into shape. You ever worked iron before this? She asked, dismounting. He set the hammer down, squinting into the light. Picked it up working trail drives out of Abilene. The boss didn't pay extra for broken gear. She looped the reins over a post. I've got a gate behind the smokehouse that sags every time it rains. If you've still got the strength, I could use your eye on it. Colton wiped his hands on a rag. Show me. They walked the narrow path between buildings, the silence between them more settled than tentative. At the gate, she pointed to the post leaning away from the frame. Ground's too soft here, she said. I've braced it twice, but it won't hold. Colton pressed a boot against the base. Dig it deeper. Pack it with gravel if you've got any. I don't. Then I'll haul some from the creek tomorrow. She glanced at him. You always this handy, he shrugged. I like things that stay fixed when I'm done with them. They worked without speaking further until the sun dipped low and the barn cast long shadows over the yard. That night, Delia brought out a bottle wrapped in cloth and set it between them on the porch. My father kept it for winters, she said, but I think he'd have made an exception. Colton uncorked it and poured a small measure into each of the tin cups she'd laid out. To what? She tilted her cup toward his. To things that hold. They drank. The whiskey was sharp at first, then warm. He didn't speak again until the fireflies came out. I had a girl once, he said, his tone quiet, before the war. She married someone else while I was gone. I didn't blame her. I just stopped looking after that. Delia drew her knees up beneath her skirt. I got asked by a man in town when I was 20. He told me I wouldn't last a year alone. I told him I'd rather die tired than live quiet. Colton's gaze didn't leave her. You've been tired a long time, haven't you? I never thought about it until now. He reached out, not quickly, and let his hand rest on hers. His skin was rough, but the weight was gentle. You don't have to keep carrying it by yourself, he said. I know, she answered. I just don't know how to put it down. Then let me stand beside you while you figure it out. The next morning they loaded the wagon with empty sacks and rode to the creek beyond the ridge. It was slow work, filling each sack with gravel and lifting them one by one into the wagon bed. By midday, sweat soaked through their shirts and Delia's hands ached from gripping the shovel. They paused beneath a cottonwood, and she passed him the last of the bread she'd brought. He tore it in half and gave her the larger piece. You always do that, she asked. What? Give more than you keep? He chewed, then nodded. I've been lucky with less before. As they rode back, the wagon creaked beneath the weight, and the horses moved at a steady plod. Delia leaned back against the seat, letting the breeze cool her skin. You planning on building something permanent? She asked. He looked toward her. If I knew what you needed, I would. I don't need anything built, she said, but I wouldn't mind someone who stays. He reached for the reins, adjusting them with a quiet care. I'm not going anywhere, Delia. She looked out over the land that had been hers for so long, every fence post and furrow hard-earned. Then let's put that gate right tomorrow, she said. And after that, I'll show you the orchard. He smiled, not wide but sure. I'd like that. They rode on, the wagon rattling over the dry road, and the dust behind them settled into silence. The orchard lay in the far west corner of the property, where the soil held just enough clay to keep water from running off too fast. The trees were spaced wide, their branches heavy with spring blossoms tinged pale pink and white. Delia led the way through the rows, her hand brushing the low-hanging boughs. Colton followed behind, quiet as always, his boots soft against the damp earth. These came from Arkansas, she said. My father brought the saplings back wrapped in wet burlap, planted them the same week he buried my mother. Colton stopped beside her, watching the petals drift down like slow rain. He must have known patience. He did. She bent to check a patch of ground where ants had tunneled near the roots. He said fruit trees were a promise you couldn't rush. You cared for them even when they gave you nothing. Colton crouched beside her and ran his fingers through the soil. They're holding. They are, she straightened. I wasn't sure they would. I've been keeping them going with prayer and guesswork. He rose with her. You've done more than guess. They walked the orchard's edge until the trees gave way to open pasture. A single fence line marked the end of her land. Beyond it, the prairie stretched unbroken, the grass moving in low waves. I've been thinking about building a smokehouse closer to the house, she said. The one we've got's too low and it floods when the creek rises. Colton glanced toward the barn. You'll need stone and timber. There's a quarry 3 miles east. I've got rights to pull what I need. I can haul it, she nodded. I know. They stood a long time at the fence, the wind tugging at her braid and lifting the brim of his hat. When she finally turned to him, her voice was low but certain. I don't want just help, Colton. I've had men offer hands before. What I want is someone who builds with me, not over me. He reached into the space between them and took her hand, his grip firm and warm. I don't know everything about building a life, he said, but I know enough to start from the ground up, and I know I want to build it with you. Her fingers curled around his. Then let's start with the smokehouse. They spent the next week hauling stone from the quarry. Colton drove the wagon, and Delia rode alongside, measuring each load to make sure the axles didn't strain. They worked past sundown, stacking the first rows of rock by lantern light. She caught him humming once low, tuneless, but steady, and didn't mention it, only listened. By the third week, the walls stood waist-high, and she'd drawn up the plans for the roof on a scrap of feed ledger. He studied her drawings with careful eyes. You've got a good eye. I learned from watching what fell apart, she said. They finished the roof on a Wednesday, the shingles cut from cedar scavenged from an abandoned line shack. When the last nail was hammered in, she stood back and looked at the shape of it, solid, square, dry, and felt something inside her settle. Colton wiped his brow with his sleeve. That's a fine thing we made. Delia looked at him, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way he stood like a man who didn't need to be anywhere else. It is. They walked back to the house without saying much. She boiled coffee while he cleaned the tools. When he came in, she was setting 2 cups on the table, her hand steady. I've got 2 empty rooms, she said. One in the loft, one beside mine. He met her gaze. Where do you want me? She didn't look away. Where you already are. He stepped forward, slow but sure, and she didn't move back. When he kissed her, it wasn't rushed. It wasn't full of fire or storm. It was quiet and complete, like a seal pressed into wax. That night, he hung his coat on the peg beside hers. When she lay down, she didn't pull the quilt to her chin. She left space and he filled it. By midsummer, the orchard bore fruit. They picked the early apples together, piling them into baskets and storing them in the cool dark beneath the stairs. He built her a canning shelf. She stitched him a new shirt from a bolt of calico she'd never had reason to use. They started rising together before dawn, sharing the silence of early hours and the first heat of the stove. The cattle grew fat. The pasture held. The fence lines stayed mended. In the fall, they married beneath the cottonwoods at the edge of the stream bed. Just a handful of neighbors came, and the preacher from town. Delia wore her mother's locket and carried a sprig of rosemary from the kitchen garden. Colton wore his brother's boots, cleaned and polished, the soles still sound. They exchanged vows without hesitation. When he said her name, he said it like it was something he'd kept safe for years. Afterward, they shared bread and stew in the barn with the neighbors. There was laughter and someone played an old fiddle. Delia never let go of his hand. That winter, the snow came early but light. They passed the cold months in warmth, reading by firelight, mending tools and baking bread. Once, in the hush before dawn, he stirred beside her and whispered, "I never knew peace could feel like this." She turned to him, her voice still thick with sleep. "It's not peace," she said. "It's home." He kissed her forehead, and neither of them said anything more. The years ahead would bring storms and dry spells, sickness and repair. But the house would hold. The orchard would bloom. And every morning before the sun rose, Colton would reach for her hand and she would give it. And they would be together, always,